In December 2023, Trevor Milton walked into a federal courtroom to hear his sentence. Just a few years earlier, he had been celebrated as one of America's most promising entrepreneurs. Investors compared him to Elon Musk. Business media called him a visionary. Now, the founder of Nikola Motors was facing prison after being convicted of fraud. The same man who promised to reinvent trucking had become one of the most controversial figures in modern business history. At its peak, Nikola was worth more than $34 billion. That made it more valuable than Ford Motor Company. Ford had spent over a century designing, building, and selling millions of vehicles around the world. Nikola had never sold vehicles at anything close to that scale. Yet Wall Street believed it deserved a higher valuation, and billions of dollars followed. Investors weren't buying a profitable company. They weren't buying proven technology. They were buying a story about clean transportation, a story about hydrogen-powered trucks, a story about a startup that claimed it could challenge some of the biggest manufacturers on Earth. For a while, that story seemed unstoppable. Then everything began to unravel. A single report triggered panic across Wall Street. Investors started asking questions. Journalists started digging. Regulators started investigating. And the company that once looked like the future suddenly looked like a mystery. At the center of that mystery was a truck. A futuristic truck featured in one of Nikola's most famous promotional videos. To investors, the video appeared to prove that Nikola's technology worked. To millions of viewers, it looked like evidence that the future had already arrived. Years later, that same video would become one of the most damaging pieces of evidence against the company. Because according to federal prosecutors, things were not always what they appeared to be. The more investigators looked into Nikola's public claims, the more contradictions they found. Presentations, interviews, product demonstrations, investor meetings. Again and again, the same question kept appearing. How much of Nikola's success was real? The answer mattered because the stakes were enormous. Billions of dollars had flowed into the company. Some investors were hedge funds, some were pension funds, some were ordinary people investing their savings. Many believed they had found the next Tesla. Instead, they would become part of one of the most expensive startup scandals of the decade. But Nikola didn't collapse because of one bad product. It didn't collapse because of one failed quarter. Its downfall was connected to something much larger. A growing gap between what investors believed and what the company could actually prove. And that gap became wider every year. What makes this story so fascinating is that the opportunity itself was real. The trucking industry desperately needed innovation. Governments wanted cleaner transportation. Investors were searching for the next breakthrough. Nikola entered the market at exactly the right moment, which makes what happened next even more remarkable. So how did a company with almost no proven technology become worth more than Ford? Why did some of the smartest investors in the world believe it? And how did one founder convince Wall Street to buy into a future that wasn't ready? This is the story of Nikola Motors and the $34 billion lie that never worked. To understand why Nikola became so valuable, you have to understand what was happening in the business world at the time. Tesla had changed everything. For years, many people believed electric vehicles would remain a niche market. Then Tesla proved that a company built around clean transportation could become one of the most valuable businesses on Earth. Investors suddenly became obsessed with finding the next Tesla. Money started flowing into almost every company connected to the future of transportation. Electric vehicles, battery technology, autonomous driving, hydrogen fuel. The market wasn't just rewarding success, it was rewarding possibility. And in an environment like that, a compelling vision could be worth billions before a company delivered a single finished product. At the same time, governments around the world were pushing for cleaner energy. The trucking industry was a major target. Heavy-duty trucks moved nearly everything people bought, used, and consumed, but they also produced enormous emissions. Whoever solved that problem could unlock one of the largest transportation markets in the world. The opportunity was worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Into that opportunity stepped Trevor Milton. Unlike many famous tech founders, Milton wasn't known as a brilliant engineer. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a world-famous inventor. His greatest talent was something else. He could sell a vision. People who met him often described him as energetic, confident, persuasive, and relentlessly ambitious. The kind of person who could make impossible ideas sound inevitable. In 2014, Milton founded Nikola Motor Company. The name was carefully chosen. Nikola Tesla was one of history's most famous inventors. Tesla Motors had already turned that name into a global brand. Even before Nikola built anything significant, its name connected it to innovation, technology, and the future. For investors, that connection mattered. But Nikola wasn't trying to build passenger cars. Milton had a different target: long-haul trucking. He claimed hydrogen-powered trucks could travel farther than battery-powered trucks and refuel in minutes instead of hours. If Nikola could make that technology work, it wouldn't just compete with existing truck manufacturers. It could completely change the industry. And that's exactly why investors became interested. Nikola wasn't selling trucks. It was selling hope. Hope for cleaner transportation. Hope for a technological breakthrough. Hope for another Tesla-sized success story. Investors weren't buying proof. They were buying potential. And in the years ahead, that distinction would become incredibly expensive. Building revolutionary transportation technology is one thing. Talking about it is another. Hydrogen-powered trucks required advanced engineering, specialized fuel systems, massive infrastructure investments, and years of testing. Even the world's largest automakers struggled with those challenges. Nikola was trying to solve all of them at once. The task was enormous. Publicly, however, Nikola projected confidence. The company announced new truck concepts, future hydrogen stations, future production targets, future partnerships. Each announcement painted a picture of a company moving rapidly toward a transportation revolution. Investors loved what they heard, but many of those promises still existed only on paper. This created a dangerous situation. The story investors believed was moving faster than the technology itself. The company's reputation was growing. Its valuation was growing. Its expectations were growing, but reality was struggling to keep pace. And the larger that gap became, the greater the risk. Yet almost nobody wanted to slow down. The electric vehicle boom was creating fortunes. Investors feared missing the next Tesla. In financial markets, fear of missing out can be more powerful than caution. As Nikola's valuation climbed, many investors stopped asking whether the company could deliver. Instead, they focused on how much money they could make if it did. Trevor Milton understood this environment perfectly. He became Nikola's most effective marketing tool. He regularly appeared in interviews, podcasts, presentations, and social media posts. He spoke confidently about future products and future capabilities. The future always sounded impressive. The present was much harder to examine. Still, a few people began asking uncomfortable questions. Industry experts wanted evidence. Analysts wanted proof. Journalists wanted details. Where were the fully functioning trucks? Where was the large-scale hydrogen network? Where was the technology that justified a multi-billion-dollar valuation? The answers often seemed vague. At first, those concerns barely mattered. Nikola's stock continued attracting attention. Investors remained optimistic. The market was rewarding possibility, not verification. But hidden beneath the excitement, a pattern was already forming. A pattern built on increasingly ambitious promises. And soon, Wall Street would begin discovering how difficult those promises were to prove. In 2020, Nikola found a shortcut to Wall Street. Instead of a traditional IPO, the company went public through a SPAC. A SPAC is essentially a shell company created to bring private businesses into public markets more quickly. At the time, SPACs were one of the hottest trends in finance. Investors were pouring billions into them. Nikola arrived at exactly the right moment. The market reaction was explosive. Within days, Nikola's valuation surged past $30 billion. At one point, it briefly became worth more than Ford Motor Company. Ford sold millions of vehicles every year. Nikola sold a vision of future vehicles. Yet for a moment, Wall Street valued them almost the same. The dream was becoming more valuable than reality. The comparison to Tesla grew stronger. Financial media began discussing Nikola as one of the most promising transportation startups in America. Retail investors rushed in. Institutional investors followed. The stock price soared, and every increase in valuation made the story seem more believable. Success itself became proof. Then came one of Nikola's biggest victories. General Motors announced a strategic partnership with the company. For investors, this looked like validation from one of the largest automakers in the world. If General Motors was willing to work with Nikola, many assumed the technology had to be legitimate. The market celebrated. Nikola shares jumped again. But while investors were celebrating, skeptics were becoming more active. Some analysts struggled to verify Nikola's claims. Others questioned whether the company could realistically achieve the goals it was promoting. The questions weren't dramatic at first. They were simple. Where was the proof? Where was the working technology? Where were the results? The higher Nikola climbed, the more attention it attracted. And attention creates scrutiny. Journalists started investigating. Industry experts started comparing public claims with available evidence. Former employees started speaking privately to reporters. Small inconsistencies began appearing. Individually, Initially, they seemed minor. Together, they formed a pattern. Then a company called Hindenburg Research entered the story. Hindenburg specialized in investigating businesses they believed were misleading investors. Unlike most analysts, they weren't trying to predict growth. They were searching for deception. And after months of research, they believed Nikola had serious problems. In September 2020, Hindenburg released a report that shook Wall Street. The report accused Nikola of misleading investors about key aspects of its technology and capabilities. Among dozens of allegations, one stood out above all the others. A famous promotional truck video. A video that millions of investors had seen. A video that appeared to prove Nikola's technology worked. And according to Hindenburg, that video wasn't what it seemed. The reaction was immediate. Within hours of Hindenburg's report, Nikola's shares began falling. Investors who had spent months chasing the company's rise suddenly rushed toward the exits. Billions of dollars in market value started disappearing. The same market that had rewarded Nikola's promises was now questioning them. And fear spreads much faster than optimism. At first, Nikola fought back. The company rejected many of the allegations. Trevor Milton defended himself publicly. Supporters argued that short sellers were attacking a disruptive startup for profit. For a brief moment, the battle became a war of narratives. One side claimed fraud. The other claimed innovation. Wall Street had to decide who to believe. Then attention turned toward the famous truck video. For years, it had been presented as evidence of Nikola's technological progress. But investigators and journalists began examining the footage more closely. The question was simple. Was the truck actually operating under its own power? Or had investors misunderstood what they were seeing? According to Hindenburg's report, the truck shown in the video had not been driving under its own propulsion in the way viewers believed. Instead, the report claimed it had been rolled down a hill. The allegation exploded across financial media. What had once been one of Nikola's most effective marketing tools suddenly became one of its biggest liabilities. And investor confidence took another hit. The damage extended far beyond the stock market. Employees who had joined Nikola because they believed in its mission faced growing uncertainty. Some had accepted stock-based compensation. Some had tied their careers to the company's future. As Nikola's reputation weakened, their future became harder to predict. The dream was beginning to crack from the inside. The pressure eventually reached Trevor Milton himself. Just weeks after the Hindenburg report was released, he resigned as executive chairman. The founder who had become the face of Nikola was gone. For many investors, the resignation felt like confirmation that the crisis was far more serious than anyone had initially believed. Nikola's shares fell even further. Meanwhile, regulators were paying close attention. The Securities and Exchange Commission began investigating whether investors had been misled. Federal prosecutors also started examining public statements made by Milton and the company. This was no longer a battle between a startup and a short seller. It had become a federal investigation, and the consequences could now include criminal charges. By this point, billions of dollars had already been destroyed. A company that had briefly been worth more than Ford was now fighting for credibility. Investors wanted answers. Employees wanted stability. Regulators wanted evidence. And investigators were about to ask the question that would define the entire case. Were Nikola's promises simply overly ambitious, or were they deliberately misleading from the very beginning? Federal investigators now faced a difficult challenge. Nikola had made countless public statements, press releases, interviews, investor presentations, podcasts, social media posts. The question wasn't whether Trevor Milton had made bold claims. The question was whether investors had been given information that was false or misleading when they decided where to put their money. Investigators started building a timeline, statement by statement, presentation by presentation, video by video. They compared what Nikola claimed publicly with what could actually be verified internally. And according to prosecutors, a troubling pattern began to emerge. The same gap appeared again and again. The gap between perception and reality. The government wasn't arguing that startup founders should never be optimistic. Silicon Valley is built on optimism. Investors expect ambitious goals. They expect risk. But prosecutors argued that some of Nikola's statements went far beyond ambition. According to the government, investors were being told that certain capabilities already existed when they did not, and that distinction mattered. In 2021, federal prosecutors formally charged Trevor Milton with fraud. The Department of Justice alleged that he had misled investors about Nikola's products, technology, and business progress. The founder, who had once stood on stage promising the future, was now preparing to defend himself in federal court. The story had moved from Wall Street to the justice system. Milton pleaded not guilty. His defense argued that he genuinely believed in Nikola's vision. That startup founders often make aggressive projections, that innovation is messy, and that many of the claims being criticized were simply expressions of optimism about the future. The trial would ultimately come down to a fundamental question: where does optimism end and deception begin? Over the following months, prosecutors presented evidence they believed showed a consistent pattern of misleading statements. Witnesses testified, documents were reviewed, public interviews were examined. The case wasn't built around a single truck video. It was built around a broader argument that investors had been given a picture of Nikola that did not match reality. Then came the verdict. In October 2022, a federal jury found Trevor Milton guilty on fraud-related charges. For prosecutors, it was confirmation that the evidence had convinced the jury. For investors who had lost money, it was validation that their concerns had not been imagined. One of the most celebrated startup founders of the EV era had become a convicted fraudster. The consequences continued. In 2023, Milton was sentenced to prison. Meanwhile, Nikola attempted to move forward under new leadership. The company still had employees, still had customers, still had projects, but rebuilding trust proved far more difficult than raising money. Because trust, once broken, is expensive to replace. What makes the Nikola story remarkable is that the opportunity itself was real. The world still needs cleaner transportation. Hydrogen technology still has potential. The trucking industry still faces enormous challenges. The future Nikola described was not impossible. The problem was convincing investors that the future had already arrived when it hadn't. In the end, Nikola became one of the most expensive lessons in modern startup history. Not because investors believed in innovation, not because they believed in technology, but because they stopped asking for proof. A company worth more than $34 billion rose on promises and collapsed under scrutiny. And one question still remains. When the next revolutionary startup appears, will investors remember Nikola, or will they fall for the same story all over again?